it right away. You can't let it sit too long. You know, you let it just dry enough to where it's still damp, and then you start burnishing. You get a pretty high sheen.
Yeah. College is just out of.
Where are you at?
I thought you were never going to make
Grand Junction, Colorado.
And that was in the late 70s. So
Western slope there near the border, Utah.
So I just shut that down with
For this small piece, I don't need much clay, and I'm getting all my material out here. It's like a pantry of stuff, you know. I use cloth to bind the slab onto the piece, and then wires. So I just carry around old sheeting, and I'll only need a couple of strips for this. Another thing I might mention, when you're doing Saggar, you know, you're using combustibles. So I, from experience, decided that, you know, seaweed works well because it's got a natural sodium content. Sodium is the dynamic in low fire. Sodium fumes, you know. Salt starts out as solid, and at about 800-900 degrees it'll turn to a liquid. I mean, it actually liquefies. And then above 900 it starts to let off sodium hydrochloride gas. And that's a strong flux. It's a strong flux on anything in ceramics. High fire, salt will glaze the silicon. It'll melt the silicon, the clay body, and glaze over. In low fire, it doesn't melt the silicon. It kind of just fluxes. It fluxes. This is B-mix. Actually, this is porcelain. This is a white porcelain. The sodium, this is from tamarisk. Tamarisk is salt cedar. It's a shrub plant that grows in the Colorado River drainage. You probably have it in California here. It was introduced to America as an erosion control plant and an ornamental type shrub. I think its origins are in the Middle East. It resembles mesquite. It's kind of a ferny plant. It's a deciduous plant. These are strands of tamarisk that have been sandwiched between two tile. These were like this, and a few strands of tamarisk were fired up to about 1700 degrees. And this is the evidence of sodium fuming. That's from the sodium in the plant. This plant concentrates sodium in its cellular structure. I don't know why. Talk to a botanist about that. But it also, knowing that it has a lot of sodium, I tried it. And sure enough, you know, it leaves a lot of fuming. Try other plants. We've experimented with just a few. Since I don't live near a coast, I don't always have access to seaweed. So I make my own, you might say. I keep a salt brine in a tub, 10-gallon bucket, and I use about 20 pounds of salt and 10 gallons of water. Keep adding salt. You can't have too much.
Is that the kosher salt or the rock salt?
Any kind of salt. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Just regular rock salt. So anyway, I make a brine, and I soak sawdust. I'll soak plant life, grass, straw, wood shavings. I keep that brewing. I've had the same salt brine going now for 10 years. You know, I keep a lid on it. It doesn't evaporate. It never goes bad. It really gets kind of rank, you know.
Yeah.
But it pickles anything, of course.
Pickles?
Yeah. And I'm going to try some, I don't know what kind of bramble this is. Is this blackberry or something?
Yeah, what? Yeah.
But that,
I didn't think you were okay.
if I don't bleed, it's not worth it. You don't bleed, it's not worth it. Anyway, different plant life may have different, I don't even know if this has sodium in it, who knows. But it's green, it'll probably reduce a little bit, and you may get shadows of the leaves since it's green. Here's what that tamarisk looks like. This is picked last year. You know, it loses its leaves in the winter. I froze this so it wouldn't dry out too much. Put it in my freezer. And it's kind of almost a piney texture, you know. Stems have more content in them, you know. You get more prominent fuming. You could try them. I don't use them much.
What's this called?
Tamarisk.
Oh, I wonder what Scotch bring we do. We have lots of that.
I usually just use a strip of cloth to measure for length, you know, what I need. But I'll throw a slab out that's plenty big.
Every now and then, it doesn't work every time. It's beautiful.
There's a lot of approaches to Saggar fire. This is one approach, and I guess you could call it thin shell Saggar because you're wrapping a thin shell around it. Now I do partial shells because I like contrast between darks and lights. You can wrap the entire piece with a shell, you know, and that'd be a complete containment. Some people do that.
Is this your own concoction?
Oh, it's evolved over a period of time. I've borrowed and stolen from various sources, historical treatments. But I did develop this because I discovered early on in my Saggar firings and attempts that the more pressure I had on the Saggar, the more distinct the markings. I'll show you that. I went to a lecture with Daniel Rhodes in about 1980 at Anderson Ranch. He talked about firing his large stoneware heads. He did busts. I don't know if you've ever seen any of them. They were larger than life size. They reminded me of Easter Island sculpture. They had references to that. What he was doing in his lecture and slideshow, and I was already doing Saggar, I was doing pot Saggars. I was making pots, or I was putting pots inside of metal paint cans, using the paint can as a Saggar, backfilling with sawdust and various combustibles. He would make sculpture, then he would dip burlap. Well, he would put a ½ inch of foam around his work when it was green. You know, just upholstery foam. And that would take up space. Then he would dip burlap. Hey, you guys. He would dip burlap in slip. And then he would wrap that burlap around the foam. What was that doing? It was making a thin shell. Okay? He would put the piece in a kiln, bisque fire it, you know, for the first time. The foam would burn up, and it would leave a void. It would leave a space. He would backfill with sawdust, various minerals, salt, oxides, and whatever. And then he would fire it up to mid-range, maybe cone 5. And he would get wonderful blushes, wonderful voodoo effects, you know. And I thought, wow, you know, maybe I need my Saggar closer to the piece. So I said, how can I do that? So I thought, well, I can use, I didn't want to use wet burlap, you know, because that would kind of stick to the piece. So I thought slabs, that's the way to go. So I started rolling slabs, putting my combustible on the slab, wrapping the slab around real tight. Sure enough, first fire, I got some high contrast, distinct transfer of fuming. So that's kind of how I arrived at that. Eric.
Hi, Derek.